I drove to my son-in-law's parents' house believing I was arriving for a simple birthday dinner, the kind of evening meant to reassure a man that his place in his daughter's life was still intact. I never imagined I would be turned into a spectacle before I even sat down. A disabled luxury car on the highway delayed me, an elderly woman needed help, and I used my hands the way I always have, ignoring the grease that soaked into my sleeves. When I finally arrived, late and marked by honest work, the disgust on my mother-in-law's face told me I had already failed some invisible test. Inside that house, I would be publicly stripped of dignity, treated as something improper, something to be removed. I didn't argue. I chose to leave. But as I reached the door, fate returned the woman I had helped, and with her, a quiet justice that none of them could stop. Before I take you back to how that night unfolded, I want to ask you something personal. If you've ever been humiliated for doing the right thing, if you've ever been made to feel small in a room where you should have belonged, stay with me. Subscribe, not out of habit, but so these stories reach people who need them. And if you've lived a moment like this, share it in the comments. Sometimes knowing we're not alone is the only repair we need. I left my apartment that evening earlier than I needed to. I always do. I've learned that arriving on time is one of the few quiet ways a man can show respect without announcing it. The highway was clear, the sky low and pale, that washed-out color that comes just before dusk settles in for good. I remember thinking, as I merged onto the expressway, that this was supposed to be an uncomplicated night. A birthday. Food. Polite conversation. The kind of gathering where nothing important is said, and that's the point. I had dressed carefully. Not formally, but cleanly. A pressed shirt, dark slacks, shoes that still held their shape. I wanted to look like someone who belonged in my daughter's life as it now existed, comfortable, orderly, respectable. I told myself that was enough. About 20 minutes into the drive, traffic slowed abruptly. Hazard lights flickered ahead like nervous signals. I eased onto the shoulder, expecting nothing more than congestion. That's when I saw her. An elderly woman stood beside a luxury sedan pulled awkwardly onto the breakdown lane, its hood raised at an angle that suggested defeat. She was small, bundled in a coat too thin for the season, her hands clasped together as cars tore past without slowing. She wasn't waving. She wasn't asking. She was simply standing there, waiting for something to happen. I don't know why I stopped. That's not false modesty, I truly don't. I've driven past dozens of stalled vehicles in my life, telling myself someone else would handle it, that I wasn't equipped, that I was late, that it wasn't my responsibility. But that evening, my foot pressed the brake almost on its own. I pulled in behind her car, put on my hazards, and stepped out into the cold air. She looked at me with surprise first, then relief so immediate it tightened something in my chest. She apologized before I could say a word, as if her inconvenience were a moral failing. The problem turned out to be simple enough. A loose connection, a belt that had slipped just enough to stop everything. I'd grown up fixing things because there was no one else to do it. Over the years, that knowledge stayed in my hands even when my life moved on to cleaner work. I rolled up my sleeves without thinking. Grease smeared across my cuffs, then my forearms. I felt the cold metal bite through my skin as I leaned in. Time passed differently out there. The highway noise faded into something distant and hollow. The woman talked a little, mostly to fill the silence, telling me she'd been on her way to a family gathering and didn't want to arrive flustered. I nodded, focused, listening just enough to be polite. When the engine finally turned over, the sound felt like a small victory neither of us celebrated properly. She reached for her purse. I stopped her with a shake of my head. It wasn't a gesture of pride. I just didn't want money to be the final note of that moment. She thanked me anyway, with a gravity that suggested she would remember my face longer than I expected. By the time I got back into my car, my hands were dark with grease, my shirt marked in places that wouldn't come clean without effort. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror and considered turning back. Changing. Calling ahead with an excuse. Instead, I started the engine and drove on. I arrived late. Not terribly late. Late enough. The house was already full when I pulled into the driveway. Lights glowed warmly behind wide windows. Laughter spilled out faintly when the door opened for someone else. I sat in the car for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, and wiped my hands with a napkin I found in the glove compartment. It helped very little. I told myself none of that should matter. I told myself that what I had done on the highway counted for something, even if no one there would ever know it. I straightened my jacket, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the door, unaware that, to them, I was already out of place. If you want, we can adjust anything here before I move on to part 3, where I step inside the house. The door opened before I could knock a second time. My son-in-law's mother stood there, framed by warm light and polished wood, dressed in something structured and pale that looked expensive without trying to be noticed. Her eyes moved first, not to my face, but down my sleeves, my cuffs, my hands. She took inventory the way some people assess damage. Her mouth tightened. Not in surprise. In disappointment. For a moment, she didn't speak at all. She simply looked at me, head tilted slightly, as if she were deciding whether something unpleasant could be ignored or needed to be addressed. I became aware of the grease again, of how it darkened the fabric, how it marked me as someone who had been doing something physical, something unplanned. Finally, she stepped aside just enough to keep the door from closing. "You're late," she said. Not as an observation. As a verdict. I nodded once. I opened my mouth to explain, then closed it again. I've learned over the years that explanations offered too quickly sound like excuses, even when they're true. I thought I might be allowed to speak once I was inside. She glanced over her shoulder, back into the house, then returned her gaze to me. The pause stretched. Long enough to make it clear I was being weighed against whatever standard she held. "Well," she said at last, "come in." It wasn't an invitation. It was a concession. I stepped into the foyer, careful not to touch anything. The floor gleamed under the lights, polished to a mirror finish. I could see my reflection faintly in it, creased shirt, dark smudges, a man who looked like he'd arrived from somewhere inconvenient. She closed the door behind me with deliberate care, then turned and looked me over again, this time more openly. Her expression didn't change, but something settled into it, something fixed. "We're already seated," she said. "Everyone's waiting." I followed her down the short hallway toward the living room. The sound of conversation drifted toward us, soft laughter, the clink of glasses. As we approached, the noise shifted. Lowered. Paused. I could feel it before I saw it, the subtle awareness that a room has when something unexpected enters it. We stepped through the doorway. The room was full. Well-dressed men and women arranged comfortably around low tables and chairs, drinks in hand, bodies angled toward one another in practiced familiarity. The lighting was warm, flattering. Everything about the scene suggested ease and belonging. Then they saw me. Conversation stalled, not dramatically, but enough. A few people looked away too quickly. Others looked and didn't bother hiding their reaction. I felt it settle over me, that quiet assessment, the unspoken question of why someone like me was here in that condition. My son-in-law stood near the far side of the room. Our eyes met briefly. His expression tightened, just slightly. Not concern. Not relief. Irritation. As if my presence had complicated something he'd hoped would remain smooth. He didn't come toward me. Neither did my daughter's father-in-law. He remained where he was, one hand resting on the back of a chair, watching the exchange with a detached interest, like a man observing a minor inconvenience he expected someone else to handle. My daughter caught sight of me then. Her eyes widened, not in disgust, but in confusion. She took a half step forward, then stopped, unsure. Her mother-in-law cleared her throat. "Everyone," she said, her voice carrying easily across the room, "Richard has arrived." She paused, just long enough. "From, wherever he's been." A few people smiled politely. One or two chuckled, uncertain whether they were meant to. The attention settled fully on me now, a dozen pairs of eyes waiting to see what I would do with it. I felt very still. Not frozen. Composed. I nodded once, again, and took a step toward an empty chair near the edge of the room. I didn't want a scene. I didn't want acknowledgement. I just wanted to sit down, to disappear into the background of a night that had already gone wrong. I reached for the chair. That's when she spoke again. "Actually," she said, her tone sharpening just enough to cut, "I don't think that will be appropriate." The room went silent. And I understood, in that moment, that this was no longer about being late. Her words hung in the air longer than they needed to. I kept my hand on the back of the chair, not because I was confused, but because I wanted to be certain of what I had just heard. Around us, no one spoke. No one moved. The silence wasn't shocked, it was expectant, as though everyone sensed this moment had been building and were curious how it would be handled. Inappropriate? I repeated quietly. She didn't answer me directly. Instead, she looked past me, toward her husband, then back to the room, as if seeking confirmation she already knew she had. "We have guests here," she said. "People who've made an effort. It's a formal dinner." Her eyes returned to my sleeves. "And you look like you just came from a garage." There it was. Clean. Public. Final. I felt something move in my chest, not anger, not humiliation exactly, but a dull recognition. This was not a misunderstanding that could be corrected with context. This was a judgment that had already been decided. My son-in-law finally spoke. "Maybe," he said, his voice tight, "you should clean up first." He didn't look at me when he said it. He addressed the space just over my shoulder, as if the words might land without him having to own them. "Or wait in the other room," his father added, evenly. "We're about to sit down." Wait. Not join. Not welcome. Wait. My daughter took a step forward then. I saw her face clearly for the first time since I'd entered, flushed, conflicted, pulled in two directions she wasn't prepared to choose between. "He was helping someone," she said quickly. "On the highway. That's why he's late." "That's why." Her mother-in-law lifted a hand. Not sharply. Calmly. The way one stops a child who has already spoken too much. "That's very nice," she said. "But it doesn't change the situation." I looked at my daughter then, really looked at her. She was waiting for someone else to intervene. Her husband. Her father-in-law. Anyone. No one did. I released the chair. I felt suddenly very tired, not physically, but in the way a man feels when he realizes he's been standing alone longer than he thought. I reached into my pocket and closed my fingers around my keys, grounding myself in something solid and familiar. "I don't want to cause discomfort," I said. My voice surprised me with its steadiness. "I'll step out." No one argued. No one protested. A few people shifted, relieved perhaps that the tension had found a direction to move in. As I turned toward the foyer, I could feel eyes following me. Not sympathetic. Observational. As though I were part of the evening's entertainment, a brief interruption now resolving itself. I had taken only a few steps when the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the room, clear, sudden, impossible to ignore. Everyone froze. The mother-in-law frowned slightly, annoyed at the timing. Her husband glanced toward the door. My daughter looked at me, uncertainty flickering again. I stopped walking. Outside, through the front window, headlights swept across the driveway, bright, deliberate, unmistakably expensive. And for the first time that night, something shifted that had nothing to do with me. The doorbell rang again, a second chime layered over the first, impatient now. My son-in-law's mother turned sharply toward the foyer, irritation briefly breaking through her composure. This was not how the evening was meant to unfold. She moved toward the door with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to being in control of arrivals. Through the glass, the car in the driveway came fully into view, a dark, high-end sedan, its lines understated but unmistakable to anyone who understood status. The kind of vehicle that announced importance without needing to explain itself. She straightened her posture before opening the door. The woman who stepped inside did not hesitate. She was elderly, but there was nothing fragile about her presence. Her coat was elegant, her posture upright, her expression calm and observant. She carried herself like someone who had never had to ask for space, only to enter it. The shift in the room was immediate. Recognition sparked across the hosts' faces, subtle but unmistakable. Smiles appeared too quickly, too carefully assembled. The father-in-law moved first, stepping forward with his hand extended, his earlier firmness dissolving into something deferential. They greeted her by name. I stayed where I was, just inside the edge of the foyer, half turned toward the door, unsure whether I was still in the process of leaving or about to become invisible. She removed her gloves slowly, her eyes scanning the room as if she were taking note of more than decor and faces. When her gaze reached me, it stopped. Her expression softened. "There you are," she said warmly. "I was hoping you'd arrived." The room went still. She stepped toward me without hesitation, ignoring the quiet confusion rippling behind her. She addressed me by name, spoke to me as if we were already known quantities to one another, as if my presence required no explanation. "I hope you don't mind," she continued. "I told them I might be a few minutes late." My car gave me some trouble earlier. A pause. But this gentleman, she said, placing a light hand on my arm, made sure I wasn't stranded on the highway. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me again, but this time, the weight of it was different. She turned to the hosts, her tone still polite, still pleasant. He spent nearly an hour repairing it. Refused compensation. Said he had somewhere important to be. Silence pressed in from all sides. I became aware, suddenly, of the contrast, of my grease-marked sleeves against their pressed fabrics, of how little that seemed to matter now. The mother-in-law's face had changed. Not drastically. Just enough. Her mouth parted slightly, then closed again. I hope, the woman said gently, that my delay didn't cause any inconvenience. No, of course not, the mother-in-law replied quickly. We're delighted you're here. The father-in-law nodded, a bit too eagerly. The woman looked back at me, her eyes narrowing just a fraction, not in suspicion, but in curiosity. You look as though you were about to leave, she said quietly. I hesitated. There was no drama in me, no desire to embellish. I was told, I said simply, that I wasn't appropriately dressed to sit with the guests. The words fell into the room like something heavy and final. No one interrupted them. The woman's expression changed then, not to anger, but to clarity. The kind that arrives when uncertainty evaporates and something essential becomes visible. I see, she said. She turned slowly, deliberately, to face the hosts. Well, she continued, her voice calm and unmistakably firm, that won't do at all. And in that moment, standing there with my keys still in my hand, I understood that the evening had reached a point from which there would be no polite recovery. No one spoke right away. The woman remained where she was, standing beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm, not possessive, not protective, just present. The room waited for the hosts to respond, the way rooms always do when authority has been quietly challenged. My son-in-law's mother recovered first. She smiled, though the smile didn't reach her eyes this time. There's been a misunderstanding, she said. We simply felt the atmosphere this evening. The woman raised a finger. Not abruptly. Just enough to stop the sentence from continuing. I understand atmosphere, she said calmly. I also understand character. She turned her head slightly toward me, then back to them. This man stopped on a busy highway when no one else did. He knelt on the asphalt. He dirted his clothes. He gave me his time without knowing who I was or what I could offer him in return. And he did it because it was the right thing to do. She paused, letting that settle. If that makes him unfit to sit in this room, she continued, then I am unfit to be in it as well. The words were not loud. They didn't need to be. They carried their own weight. A flicker of alarm passed through the father-in-law's expression. He glanced at his wife, then back at the woman, recalibrating. Please, he said, there's no need to escalate this. I disagree, she replied evenly. This is exactly the moment when things either escalate, or clarify. She looked around the room then, at the guests who had watched quietly, at the ones who had laughed uncertainly earlier, at my son-in-law, who now looked as though the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. Respect, she said, is not situational. It does not depend on pressed sleeves or arrival times. And it certainly does not disappear because someone arrives marked by service instead of comfort. She turned fully toward the hosts again. If he leaves, she said, I leave with him. Silence followed. Thicker this time. More consequential. My daughter stood very still. Her eyes moved from the woman to me, then to her husband, searching for something solid to hold on to. He did not meet her gaze. The mother-in-law inhaled slowly. I could see calculation working behind her eyes now, not pride, not offense, but cost. Whatever this woman represented, it was something they did not want to lose. There's no reason for anyone to leave, she said at last. Of course he can stay. The words came out stiffly, like an item being returned to a shelf. The woman studied her for a long moment. Thank you, she said. Now, tell me something. She looked at me again, gently. Did anyone apologize? No one had. The room understood then that this was no longer about saving face. It was about accountability. And for the first time since I arrived, I felt something unexpected settle over me, not triumph, not vindication, but a quiet certainty. I hadn't been wrong to stop on the highway. I hadn't been wrong to walk into that house as I was. And I hadn't been wrong to leave when I was told I didn't belong. The apology, when it finally came, did not sound the way apologies are supposed to sound. It came in pieces. A softened tone here. A careful choice of words there. No one said they were wrong outright. No one met my eyes long enough to say it cleanly. Instead, the mother-in-law gestured toward the chair I had nearly taken earlier, as if the problem could be solved by rearranging furniture. "Please," she said. "Sit. We don't want to make this uncomfortable for anyone." The woman beside me didn't move. "Discomfort," she replied, "is already here. We're simply deciding who carries it." Only then did my son-in-law step forward. He cleared his throat, straightened his jacket, and finally looked at me, not as a complication, but as someone he was being forced to acknowledge. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were quick, functional. It was, handled poorly. I nodded once. I wasn't looking for more than that. I wasn't looking for less, either. The woman seemed satisfied enough to let the moment settle. She released my arm and took a step toward the center of the room, reclaiming her place in it with the ease of someone who had never truly lost it. "I should explain," she said, turning to the hosts. "I was delayed because I was on my way to discuss a matter we've all been anticipating." Every head tilted slightly. The shift was subtle, but I felt it, interest sharpening into attention. "You see," she continued, "I've been reconsidering my involvement." The mother-in-law's smile thinned. The father-in-law's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We were counting on your support," he said carefully. "Yes," she replied. "And support is something I give freely, when I trust the people involved." She let her gaze travel back to me briefly, then returned to them. "Tonight gave me information I didn't have before." No one asked what that information was. They already knew. The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls closer, as if the evening had folded in on itself. Guests shifted, some looking down at their glasses, others glancing toward the door as if considering their own exits. My daughter approached me quietly. She stood close enough that only I could hear her. "I'm so sorry," she said. Her voice trembled, not from embarrassment, but from something closer to recognition. I should have said more. I placed a hand lightly over hers. It was the only reassurance I had to offer. "This isn't on you," I told her. The woman cleared her throat once more. "I won't be staying for dinner," she announced. "And I won't be moving forward with our plans." The words landed with finality. "I hope," she added, "that this evening serves as a reminder. People are not judged by how cleanly they arrive, but by what they're willing to do when no one is watching." She turned toward me. "If you'd like," she said, "I would appreciate the company." I didn't look at the hosts. I didn't look at the guests. I looked only at my daughter, then back at the woman. "I would," I said. As we walked toward the door together, no one tried to stop us. Behind us, the gathering unraveled, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way reputations do when something essential has been exposed. And as I stepped out into the night air, grease still on my sleeves, dignity intact, I felt something I hadn't expected when I left home that evening. I felt restored. The night air felt colder than it had when I arrived, but it was a clean cold, the kind that sharpens rather than numbs. The door closed behind us with a muted click, sealing in the warmth, the voices, the half-finished evening that no longer belonged to me. The woman walked beside me toward the driveway, unhurried. Gravel crunched softly under our steps. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Some silences don't need filling. They exist to let things settle into their proper shape. "I'm glad you stayed long enough to be seen," she said finally. Not as praise. As fact. "So am I," I replied. And I meant it in a way that surprised me. Her car waited at the edge of the drive, lights dimmed now, engine quiet. She turned to face me, studying my face with the same directness she'd used all evening. There was no curiosity left in her eyes, only assessment already completed. "They build their world very carefully," she said. "People like that. Polished surfaces. Predictable outcomes. They forget how fragile it all is." I nodded. I'd seen it before, in different rooms, different contexts. Power that mistook itself for permanence. She opened the passenger door of her car. "Come," she said. "There's a place nearby that still remembers how to treat people." We drove without ceremony. The road unwound ahead of us, streetlights passing in steady rhythm. I glanced down at my hands resting in my lap, still darkened, still marked. For the first time that night, I didn't feel the urge to hide them. You didn't have to do that, I said after a while. Inside. She smiled faintly. Yes, she said. I did. We stopped at a quiet restaurant, nothing grand, nothing curated. Just warm light, worn wood, the low hum of people eating without pretense. The kind of place that doesn't care who you know. As we sat across from one another, something shifted in me, not relief exactly, but alignment. The sense that the evening had ended where it should have begun. I won't be returning their calls, she said as she folded her napkin. And I imagine there will be consequences. For them. That's not why I stopped, I replied. I know, she said. That's why it mattered. Later, when we parted ways, she took my hands briefly in hers, grease and all, and thanked me again. Not for the repair. For the choice. I drove home alone, the city quiet around me. Somewhere behind me, a gathering dissolved into awkward goodbyes and unfinished plates. Somewhere else, my daughter would be reckoning with what she'd seen. And I carried with me something I hadn't brought into that night. The certainty that my worth had never been theirs to grant, or deny. The days after that night unfolded without drama, which is how the most meaningful consequences usually arrive. No raised voices. No confrontations. Just small shifts that, taken together, changed the shape of things. My daughter called me the next morning. Her voice sounded different, measured, careful, as if she were walking through a room she was only just beginning to see clearly. I keep replaying it, she said. The moment they told you to leave. And the moment I didn't stop it. I didn't rush to reassure her. Some realizations need space to breathe. You saw something important, I said. That's not nothing. She was quiet for a while. They've always been like that, she admitted. I just adjusted myself around it. I thought that was what you do. I knew that pattern well. It's how people survive environments that punish honesty. You shrink without realizing you're shrinking. After we hung up, I went about my days as usual. Work. Errands. Ordinary conversations with people who didn't know, or need to know, what had happened. But I noticed things I hadn't before. How lightly I moved through my routines. How little I replayed the humiliation itself, and how clearly I remembered the moment I chose to leave. That choice had done something quiet and permanent. A week later, I heard through my daughter that the gathering's aftermath had not been kind to its hosts. Invitations paused. Calls went unanswered. A project they'd been confident about, one tied closely to the woman who'd walked out with me, was suddenly no longer moving forward. No one framed it as punishment. It wasn't. It was alignment. People saw what they needed to see. My daughter began setting boundaries that surprised even her. Shorter visits. Clearer expectations. A refusal, finally, to smooth over behavior that made her uneasy. Her husband struggled with it at first. Then he began to notice how much effort she'd been spending just to be tolerated. One evening, she came over for dinner. Just the two of us. No performance. No audience. I think I forgot, she said quietly, that dignity isn't something you earn by behaving correctly. It's something you protect. I smiled at that. Not because it was wise, though it was, but because it was hers. As for me, I kept the shirt I'd worn that night. Washed, of course. But I didn't throw it away. It hangs in my closet now among things far more presentable. It reminds me that respect has very little to do with appearance, and everything to do with how a man chooses to act when no one is watching. That evening on the highway didn't delay my life. It clarified it. There was a time when I would have replayed that night differently. I would have lingered on the looks, the words, the pause before the insult landed. I would have questioned myself, my timing, my judgment, my clothes. I would have wondered whether I should have explained more clearly, arrived earlier, chosen differently. That man believed dignity was negotiated. I see now how much energy that belief consumed. The careful calibration of tone. The constant readiness to smooth things over. The quiet habit of shrinking just enough to keep the room comfortable. It wasn't weakness. It was training. Years of learning how to survive spaces that rewarded polish over principle. Driving home from work one evening, a week or so after everything, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror and realized I felt lighter. Not happier. Clearer. As if some long-standing obligation had quietly expired. I no longer felt responsible for teaching people how to treat me. That shift reached backward, too. I thought about other rooms, other tables, other moments where I had laughed something off that shouldn't have been laughed off. Where I'd stayed seated when I should have stood. Where I'd stayed silent because silence felt easier than consequence. I didn't feel regret. Just understanding. My daughter noticed it before I named it. She said I seemed different. Quieter, but steadier. Less inclined to fill space. I think, she said one afternoon, I'm learning how not to apologize for existing. I told her that was a good skill to practice. One that gets harder the longer you wait. There was no grand victory to celebrate. No call from the hosts. No formal reckoning. That, too, felt right. Real change rarely announces itself. It just alters the weather. When invitations came later, carefully worded, vaguely conciliatory, I declined without explanation. Not out of spite. Out of alignment. I had learned what that room required of me, and I no longer wished to pay the price of admission. The woman from the highway sent a note a month later. Short. Gracious. No references to influence or outcomes. Just thanks. And a line that stayed with me. Character shows itself most clearly when it interrupts our plans. I folded the note and put it away. Some nights, when the world feels especially loud, I think back to the sound of the door closing behind me, the clean finality of it. I remember the weight of my keys in my hand. The calm of choosing myself without needing permission. That choice didn't make me harder. It made me honest. There's a quiet that settles in after you stop negotiating your place in other people's lives. At first, it feels like absence, fewer invitations, fewer obligatory calls, fewer moments spent performing gratitude for things that never quite felt like gifts. But then it reveals itself for what it is, space. I began to notice how much of my time had been shaped by anticipation. Anticipation of approval. Of tolerance. Of being allowed to remain without causing discomfort. When that expectation fell away, my days rearranged themselves without effort. I started saying no earlier. Not sharply. Just clearly. I stopped offering explanations that invited debate. I discovered that most people accept boundaries far more readily than we fear, they only resist when they sense uncertainty. My daughter came by one afternoon and found me working in the garage, the door open, sunlight spilling across the concrete floor. I was fixing a hinge that had been sticking for years. It didn't need urgent repair. I simply wanted to do it. You seem settled, she said, watching me work. I am, I replied. She leaned against the doorframe, quiet for a while. Then she said something that stayed with me. I used to think strength looked loud. Assertive. Unyielding. She paused. Now I think it looks like knowing when to leave. I smiled at that, not because it flattered me, but because it meant she was learning something she wouldn't have to unlearn later. Her marriage began to change in small ways, too. Not because of arguments, but because patterns had been interrupted. When one person stops absorbing discomfort, it has to go somewhere else. Sometimes it dissolves. Sometimes it demands reckoning. I didn't interfere. I didn't advise unless asked. I had learned that dignity is best modeled, not explained. As for me, I found myself drawn toward simpler rooms. Friends who spoke plainly. Dinners where no one scanned the table for hierarchy. Places where grease on your hands wasn't a mark against you, but evidence of having done something useful. The memory of that night softened with time, losing its edge but keeping its clarity. It became a reference point, not a wound. A reminder of the moment I chose not to plead my case to people who had already decided how much I was worth. I didn't lose anything essential by leaving that house. I gained orientation. The change didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, the way most lasting things do. I noticed it first in my posture. Not straighter, just easier. My shoulders no longer carried that subtle tension of readiness, the unconscious preparation to defend, explain, soften, or accommodate. I walked into rooms without rehearsing who I needed to be once I got there. That was new. At a small gathering a few weeks later, someone made an offhand remark that once would have pulled a polite laugh out of me. The kind of comment that tests whether you'll accept being diminished for the sake of harmony. I didn't react. I didn't confront it either. I simply let it land unanswered. The silence did the work for me. I realized then that respect isn't something you demand or request. It's something that reorganizes itself around you when you stop chasing it. People adjust. Or they drift away. Both outcomes are informative. My daughter told me later that she'd started noticing the same thing in herself. How often she'd been editing her reactions, her needs, her boundaries, just to keep situations manageable. How exhausting that had been without her ever naming it as exhaustion. I didn't know I was tired, she said. I just thought that was adulthood. I understood that. We confuse endurance with maturity for far too long. The memory of that night, the doorway, the chair, the words that were meant to place me, had fully transformed by then. It no longer replayed as humiliation. It played as instruction. A lesson delivered sharply, yes, but clearly. It taught me this: when you accept disrespect quietly, you teach people how to repeat it. When you leave calmly, you teach them something else entirely. I didn't become colder after that night. I became more precise. I chose my time, my company, my energy with intention instead of obligation. I stopped mistaking tolerance for acceptance. And perhaps most importantly, I stopped confusing usefulness with worth. Helping that woman on the highway hadn't earned me dignity. It had revealed it. The dignity was already there, long before I turned the wrench or got my hands dirty. It simply hadn't needed that room to confirm it. Now, when I walk into a space, I don't scan for approval. I scan for alignment. And if I don't find it, I know how to leave without resentment. That knowledge has stayed with me. Steady. Unshakable. The last shift came without ceremony. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that doesn't mark itself as important while it's happening. I was standing in line at a hardware store, waiting to pay for a few small things I didn't urgently need. A man behind me was impatient, shifting his weight, sighing loudly, making sure his irritation was felt. Once, that kind of behavior would have nudged me into apology, an instinctive, unnecessary concession for existing in shared space. This time, it didn't. I stood where I was. Calm. Unmoved. Not defiant, not passive, simply present. And I realized, in that quiet moment between transactions, that I was no longer carrying the residue of other people's discomfort as if it were my responsibility. That was the peace. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't pride. It was something steadier. A sense that I no longer needed rooms to validate me, nor audiences to understand me. The kind of peace that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need agreement. My daughter noticed it again, weeks later, when we were walking together after dinner. The street was quiet, the evening cool. She slipped her arm through mine the way she used to when she was younger. You know, she said, I think that night changed more than I realized. I didn't ask how. I stopped trying so hard, she continued. Stopped explaining myself to people who were never really listening. It's freeing. I nodded. That was the word. Freeing. Not from responsibility. From distortion. The people who had watched me leave that house, some of them would remember the moment vaguely, as an awkward interruption. Others would remember it clearly, as a line crossed and then redrawn. Either way, their memories no longer mattered to me. What mattered was this: I had chosen myself without spectacle. Without cruelty. Without needing to win. And that choice had echoed outward in ways I never could have planned. I still help when I can. I still stop when something needs fixing and no one else is stepping forward. My hands still get dirty. My plans still get interrupted. But I no longer confuse inconvenience with insignificance. That night didn't give me a victory. It gave me clarity. As the weeks passed, the memory of that night settled into something quieter, something less sharp. It became part of the landscape of my life rather than a landmark I kept returning to. That's how you know a moment has finished teaching you what it came to teach. I thought often about dignity, not as an abstract idea, but as a daily practice. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that doesn't require witnesses. I realized that most of the dignity in my life had been exercised in small, unrecorded moments, stopping on a shoulder of the highway, leaving a room without slamming the door, choosing not to argue when argument would only cheapen the truth. No one applauds those choices. No one writes them down. And yet they shape a man more reliably than any public victory ever could. I began to understand that dignity isn't proven when you're welcomed, it's proven when you're tested. When you're offered comfort at the cost of self-respect. When staying would mean becoming smaller, quieter, easier to overlook. That night, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand recognition. I didn't expose anyone or savor their discomfort. I simply declined to accept the role that had been assigned to me. And in doing so, I reclaimed something I hadn't realized I'd been lending out for years. My daughter once asked me if I ever wished I'd handled it differently. If I wished I'd said more. I told her the truth. No, I said. Because the point wasn't to be heard. The point was to leave whole. That seemed to stay with her. I think now about legacy, not the kind measured in money or reputation, but the quieter one. The example set without instruction. The permission it gives others to stop explaining themselves into exhaustion. If someone ever asks me what that night meant, I won't describe the insult or the reversal or the woman who walked out beside me. I'll say something simpler. I'll say it was the night I remembered that I don't need to belong everywhere to belong to myself. And that, I've learned, is enough. Life didn't change dramatically after that. No doors swung open. No apologies arrived months later wrapped in insight. The world kept moving at the same pace it always had. And that, I think now, was the final confirmation that I'd done the right thing. Because dignity, real dignity, doesn't require a reaction. I went back to my routines. Morning coffee. Work that kept my hands busy and my mind quiet. Evenings that ended without tension coiled in my chest. When invitations came, I chose carefully. Not out of bitterness, but discernment. I had learned that where you go matters less than how you feel when you're there. My daughter grew steadier, too. Not louder. Not hardened. Just more herself. She stopped translating her needs into something more palatable. She stopped apologizing for pauses, for boundaries, for moments of clarity that made other people uncomfortable. Watching that unfold felt like the most honest outcome of that night. Sometimes I think back to the doorway, the look on her face, the way the room held its breath, the moment my hand left the chair. I don't replay it with satisfaction. I replay it with gratitude. Because it showed me exactly where the line was, and exactly how quietly it could be drawn. I still stop when someone needs help. Still arrive with the marks of honest work on me now and then. Still leave rooms when I sense the cost of staying would be too high. None of that feels like loss anymore. It feels like alignment. There will always be places that measure worth by polish, by appearances, by how seamlessly you fit into their version of order. I no longer take that personally. Those rooms aren't wrong. They're just not mine. What I carry forward instead is simple, the knowledge that I don't need permission to stand where I belong, and I don't need witnesses to know when I've done right by myself. That night didn't end with applause or reconciliation. It ended with something better.